Mark Pesce is a futurist, an inventor, writer, entrepreneur, educator and a podcaster. In 1994, he co-invented VRML, a 3D interface to the web. He was a judge on one of our very popular Australian ABC programs called The New Inventors. He writes an award-winning column for the global tech publication The Register. He brings lots of skills as a futurist to diverse sectors of the economy, including financial institutions, Westpac Bank, World Bank, HSBC and SWIFT. They could all have a bit of help at present. I hope you're reliably engaged with some of those currently, Mark. And regularly facilitates and mentors hackathons on topics as diverse as fintech, blockchain, virtual reality and education. He has 2 podcasts, This Week in Startups Australia and The Next Billion Seconds. He'll tell us what that really means. He was the winner of the Best Technical and Scientific Podcast in 2018. He's written only 6 books, and he'd better get cracking on that too, including The Playful World, which uses toys such as Furby and Lego Mindstorms to illuminate the interactive world of the 21st century. He's founded graduate programs at both the University of Southern California and the Australian Film, Radio and Television School, and holds appointments as Honorary Associate at the University of Sydney and an Honorary Adjunct at the University of Technology in Sydney. His topic today, more than just a series of tubes, the digital revolution and how it will supercharge your skills. He'll be taking some questions later. Please welcome Mark Pesce.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge Sir Peter's wonderful opening. Shane, thank you for your wonderful opening. The World Plumbing Council, all of the international guests, welcome to Melbourne. I live in Sydney, but I'm allowed to love Melbourne. I have a dispensation. Many, many thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today and the opportunity to give the opening keynote at, is it the 12th World Plumbing Congress? It's a great honor. It was a surprise because I am not a plumber, I am not a builder, I am not an architect, I'm not an urban planner, I am none of those things. I'm a futurist. What's a futurist, you're probably wondering? And why is one opening the World Plumbing Conference? Well, let's start with what a futurist is not. That's a psychic. You can ask a psychic who's going to win the Melbourne Cup. Futurists don't predict the future. What we do is we tell you what's likely to happen based on our understanding of what has happened and what's happening right now. Turns out that a good futurist has to be a little bit of a historian as well. We need to be across the past so we can have a good look at the present. There's a real good rule of thumb that futurists use, which is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. It's just not everywhere yet. Each of us, everyone in this room, in some part of our worlds, is already living in the future, but not all the time and not everywhere. And the future is that moment when that unusual thing that's happening over there becomes the normal thing that's happening everywhere. And I tell you this is one of my professional secrets, because it's my hope that when we've finished up here, you're all going to feel a little bit like futurists yourselves. You're going to be ready to go out there and find those bits in your own practice and in your own lives where the future is cropping up in the present. Now, sometimes I stumble across bits of the future. Other times I go in search of the future. And for me, one of the best places to go in search of the future is the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Now, how many of you have ever been to CES? So this is 250,000 people coming to Las Vegas. It's the biggest convention in Las Vegas, which is saying something. At the beginning of January, to basically take a look at the greatest gadgets from, the usual suspects. Samsung, Sony, LG, Kohler. Wait a minute, Kohler? Kohler makes plumbing, right? They make faucets and things. Why would Kohler be at the Consumer Electronics Show? Why would Kohler have brought the most exciting thing I saw this year to the Consumer Electronics Show? And you're wondering, what could that possibly be? Well, This is it. It's called the Kohler Connect. It's the world's smartest kitchen faucet. It's plumbing, but not as we've known it. Say, Alexa, pour me a cup of water. And it does, as if by magic. But that's actually the least of its magic. Alexa, pour me 100 milliliters of water. And it does. And this is where I'm going out on a little bit of a limb because I don't know if it does it yet, but it soon will. I can say, Alexa, pour me 200 milliliters of water at 38 degrees. And it will because it can. And truth be told, the technology behind Kohler Connect, it is not some great leap forward in plumbing, because that's not exactly where the innovation lies with this product. All of the technical bits here, but there's solenoid-driven valves, there's some control electronics. There is nothing in this that we haven't had in one way or another for 50 years or more. But that's not the way to think of Kohler Connect, because the name Kohler Connect gives the game away, Connect, meaning that it's connected to Amazon Alexa or Apple Siri or Google Assistant. Now, from the point of view of a homeowner where you've installed this, that's the key feature. But if you dig into that a little bit, you can see that it's a future not just for the homeowner, but for plumbing. Because Alexa and Siri and Google Assistant, yes, you can speak to them through a smartphone or through a smart speaker or through your faucet, but they don't live inside those devices. They don't really live anywhere at all, or rather they live off in this thing that we call the cloud these days, which is our name for this vast, mostly invisible, planetary-scale computing resource connected via the internet. An internet that was once famously described by Ted Stevens, who is the senator from the US state of Alaska, as a series of tubes. An internet that is turning 50 years old this month. The internet is another kind of plumbing. It's a plumbing for information, although it lacks drains. Instead, information just circulates endlessly, going round and round and round and round. So when I say, Siri, pour me a cup of water at 5 degrees, what happens? Well, those sounds are compressed into symbols. Those symbols are sent halfway around the world to a vast facility that's filled with computers, and they get translated there into some basic commands, which then get sent back halfway around the world to the Kohler Connect. And the whole thing takes less than a second if it's all working properly, which it does, mostly. And that means that my faucet isn't connected to Alexa or Siri or Google Assistant. In a real sense, it means that my faucet is now connected to everything. And so, in order to get my faucet to respond to my voice commands, it needs to be plugged into a range of different kinds of systems. Some of those systems will recognize my American accent. Some of them will recognize my words. Some of them will turn those words into meaning. Some of them will turn that meaning into actions. And each of these are separate operations, none of which you're aware of. They're all very complicated tasks. They all required thousands of hours of engineering to craft. But more than that, they involved staggering amounts of learning. Because engineering by itself won't build a system that can recognize my voice or your voice or work out our words or what we mean when we say them. There are too many voices, there are too many words, there are too many meanings for that to be possible. And so instead, what happens is these days, engineers build machines that learn from every voice spoken to them, every word said to them, every meaning that's trying to be coaxed out of them. And these machines get most of it wrong at the start almost all the time. But the engineers have designed these machines to learn from their mistakes, just like people do. And so every time that machine makes a mistake, it remembers it, and it's a little bit less likely to make that mistake again. But these systems need to make a lot of mistakes. Not hundreds of mistakes, not thousands, not millions. These systems need to make billions of mistakes before they can be good enough for me to be able to bark a command at my kitchen sink. Because there's a lot of chance that there could be some background noise or a sound reflection or just a mispronunciation that would render something unintelligible to a machine. A human being wouldn't have any trouble figuring out what I meant, but we're human. So my faucet isn't just connected to the internet and all of the information with all of those systems. It's also connected to artificial intelligence that has spent the equivalent of thousands of human lifetimes mastering tasks that we'd already worked out long before we got to Kindy. And that's one reason why I gave Kohler Connect my personal Best in Show award at CES. Because it's not simply the story of a faucet. It's a story of what's happening to all of plumbing. Because all of it, everything that you do, it's going to change. It's going to be connected to these vast systems of information, capacity, learning, artificial intelligence. That will change your practice. It's going to change your participation. And you better believe it's going to change your idea of protection. For example, let's say you've installed this. What happens when a hacker hacks into a house and turns on all the taps when you're on holidays? You know, if the drains are open, you're just going to have a big water bill. But of course, the drains are also going to be under computer control. And then, well, you have a different problem and you have a huge water damage bill. What happens if the system gets reprogrammed, or if it just malfunctions, or if there's a bug? And when you ask for a 35-degree shower, it gives you a 65-degree shower, and then you're scalded. And you can imagine endless possibilities for how the plumbing in a home can be weaponized. And this is precisely my point. Connected systems have possibilities. They have potentials that unconnected systems simply do not. Already, all of us have antivirus software on all of our computers to do our best to keep hackers from breaking in and wreaking damage. What happens when we need antivirus systems for our plumbing? And that is most definitely coming. And if you're starting to feel like this is all a little bit too much, a little overwhelming, well, we're just getting started. Because although I've identified some of the perils here, there are also some amazing potentials. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at some of those. Now, Kohler Connect is a product that's designed for the consumer. It's something that gets installed, you're done there. And that installation is the last step, from your point of view, in a very long process of design, architecture, planning, resources, logistics, staffing. All of those elements have to come together more or less perfectly for that installation to happen. And so project management, from beginning to end, that's always been at some level the essence of the trade of building anything. And it takes a lot of skill to manage a project well. It also takes a fair bit of experience. Generally takes a fair bit of luck. There's a lot of embodied knowledge in project management. There are things that you have to learn on the job. Sometimes there are mistakes that you have to make. There are things you can't know until you've done the hard yards. So project management is generally a role people work themselves into after years of practice, or at least that was the case. Now, as was pointed out, I host a few podcasts, actually 4, not 2, maybe more, but this is the current count. And the longest running of these is the one that's on the right there called This Week in Startups Australia. And that show gives me a great opportunity because it basically gives me a blank check to talk to really smart entrepreneurs who are doing their best to create amazing companies, generally by inventing really good tech. And that was how I met Chris O'Halloran, who's a Brisbane-based entrepreneur and a founder of a startup known as Takeoffs. Now, the Takeoffs product is deceptively simple, but it's also really sophisticated because what it invites you to do is it invites you to scan your plans and then receive back a marked up plan and a detailed bill of materials. And Takeoffs can do that for you for a couple $100. And that's not just simple outsourcing. This is not just that you're sending it off to a low-wage region such as India or the Philippines for a human being to do all of this work. It's a combination of artificial intelligence and human fine-tuning working together. So Takeoffs removes hundreds of hours of work from the project planning, from the resourcing, from the management, and it also removes a lot of the opportunities for mistakes. Things won't get overlooked. The computer tends to not overlook things. It tends to not forget anything. And that's not to say that any of this is in any way perfect. Automating something means that you've given computers permission to be stupid at scale. And we all have to admit that. But that's where the human factor comes in. Because Takeoffs isn't completely automated. They automate everything they can. They leave the rest to people. And so the final pass, the final tuning with every plan is done by a human being. And all of that tuning is then fed back into the automation so that it can learn from its mistakes. And so the next time a plan gets submitted, it can do a better job and a better job. And the automation continues to grow more accurate, and it needs progressively less human hand-holding. Now, that need for oversight is never going to disappear completely, because this is where we mistake the power of artificial intelligence. There's a lot of people who run around screaming, my God, it's going to steal all of our jobs. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't remove the need for human beings. It means we do different things. There's a really notorious case of how this works in practice. It comes from the automobile industry. So, about 3-4 years ago, Elon Musk announced the Model 3 sedan would be coming out, the Tesla, and he said it will be manufactured on a completely robotic assembly line. And people around the world hailed him as a visionary, except in Germany and Japan, where they just shook their heads and smiled to themselves because they had tried this back in the 90s and it didn't work. And so Tesla builds their robotic production line, the Model 3s start rolling off that production line, and nearly every single one is rejected on quality control grounds. What Tesla learned in a very expensive lesson is that robots are really good at manipulating big plates of metal and moving the chassis around, but they are not well suited to all the little fiddly tasks of assembling an automobile. So cables ended up in the wrong place or incorrectly attached and so forth. And without humans in the loop, the robots simply did what they were programmed to do, even though they were doing it wrong. And no one knew this until the Teslas rolled off the assembly line broken. And so Tesla had to revisit their entire production line. They had to map out the areas where robots could do a better job than humans could, and where humans could do a better job than robots. And once they had worked that out, once they had gotten both the robots and the humans trained for their new roles, Tesla could get back to manufacturing cars at scale. And that mistake cost Tesla a year, which was long enough for Volkswagen and Nissan and General Motors to get their electric vehicles onto the market. Tesla lost its lead because it believed it could get robots to do the work of humans. Now, Tesla's expensive lesson could be a cheap lesson for the rest of us if we can learn from it, if we can understand the limits between man and machine. There's a lot of work right now that humans do simply because there's no alternative, such as the painstaking work of crafting estimates and developing resourcing requirements from a project plan. Takeoffs can do that up to a point. Once the estimate has been generated, once the set of resources has been developed, the project manager has to go through all of it and subject it to a sanity check. They have been freed from the drudgery of all the detail work. They still need to wrap their heads around the project. It's a different kind of task. It's a different set of skills. It's a different way of working. Okay, so let's take that little example of takeoffs. And again, like Kohler Connect, this is a part of the future that is now popping up in the present over there. Let's take that example and grow it out so that that same basic idea touches every facet of construction and plumbing, because that's where this is going. Now, I just recently installed an app on my phone called Onyx. Onyx uses the camera on the smartphone to scan my body as I'm going through an exercise routine. And so it can track my progress, it can track my form, it can track my repetitions. It's a bit like having an exercise physio inside the app. And it mixes machine vision and machine learning to do that. So if you take those basic ideas, which again are already showing up in smartphone apps, and now let's mix that with what takeoffs can do, and you get a sense of the kinds of capacities that you'll be getting in apps in the near future. In the near future, when materials come to a site, they're going to get scanned by an app that uses machine vision to recognize them and machine learning to match those materials against the bill of sale, against the requirements, against the plan, to make sure they're all in agreement. And that's more detail in general than a human would have time for. And here it's basically instantaneous. And then it produces a set of suggestions about where and when those materials should be stored so they're available at the point of use. And another app will suggest the layout of the plumbing, optimizing for architecture, building code, material cost, and labor, all of that on the fly, all of that in concert with the plumber and the architect and the builder. And as the plumber is doing installation, another app is going to keep an eye on the work, making suggestions, alerting to mistakes, or just noting things that the app can see but the plumber can't, performing quality inspections in real time, inspections that will be submitted electronically to a building inspector for review and approval, and so on and so on. The computer hasn't taken over the process here, nor is the computer managing the process here, but the computer is the partner in the process. And at every step of the process, it's working with humans in a partnership that makes them both perform better than either one could perform on its own. And it's this transformation in practices, as we integrate a new generation of intelligent tools that will be framing the plumbing profession over the next billion seconds, the next 30 years. And we're starting out today with tools like takeoffs. And long before 2050, we will see these tools fully integrated at every step of the process. It will mean that we'll have a different way of working, and it will be a different way of thinking about how we work. Now, this is not going to be a sudden change. These tools will be arriving piecemeal, dribs and drabs over the next decades. But because of that, it means that everyone who wants to keep current in the profession, keep current in their practice, will need to be learning how to use these new tools as they arrive. And this brings us to our final, really our most important point, which is the future of participation. Okay. Let's take a look at one of the great strengths of the practice of the profession of plumbing, which is that it's based on the idea of apprenticeship. You can't just book learn your way into plumbing. You can't just earn your way into a certification. Plumbing doesn't work like that. You have to learn plumbing experientially. You have to learn by doing, and you learn from someone who has been plumbing for years. That's a transmission of skills and knowledge and experience that goes back at least all the way to ancient Rome, and it's kept up in that way because it works. Because it's the way to ensure that plumbers are protected from gaps in their own knowledge or lack of experience. You folks already know all of this. There is no need to explain to plumbers why it is an apprentice-based profession. It's obvious. What may not be obvious is that what we're starting to see is that just as plumbing has always operated from its strength as an apprenticeship-based profession, all of the rest of the world is about to follow. I want to put this into a bigger context. Now, as we're seeing, the pace of change is accelerating, and that means that it is multiplying the number of new tools that we have to do our work, and it's making those tools more sophisticated. That means it is going to be a constant struggle for people to stay current, to keep learning, and that is not just true for plumbing. That is going to be true and already is true for every business everywhere. And most organizations out there are not prepared for this. You hire someone with a given set of skills that are well suited to a particular role, and they use those skills in that role until they retire or get bored and move on to something that is more interesting. That is pretty much what jobs have always been. That is not what jobs are becoming. We can see already in a few businesses here and there that employees are upskilling themselves so that they can stay current and so that they can move to new roles inside of organizations. And as organizations start to grow more comfortable with upskilling, they're going to be working with those employees to develop career trajectories, which keep those employees engaged, keep them learning, while also keeping the organization moving forward on its own trajectory, toward its own goals. AT&T, the giant American telco, is already doing this. 71% of all AT&T employees are engaged in upskilling on the job right now. That's one place where the future is already here. There aren't any really good examples of businesses in Australia doing this. Telstra right now would rather lay off 10,000 people and hire 10,000 other people. This is literally what they're doing right now, rather than considering retraining that already employed 10,000 people, even though that would probably be cheaper and less disruptive to Telstra and to the Australian economy. Because we still think about employees and roles as fundamentally static. And this is where you get to see the enormous advantage of apprenticeship-based professions. Does an apprenticeship ever truly end? Does anyone ever say, really, we're done here, we're done here? Or is it rather that an apprentice reaches a level of competence in some particular skill that they can demonstrate in practice, that they can have assessed by their peers, and in the final instance, that they can pass along to another apprentice? All of that's matter of fact to a plumber. That's how the profession works. All of that would be entirely revolutionary to most businesses. Simply not the way they work. That's going to have to change. that change will happen over the next decade. Somewhere between 2020 and 2030, most organizations will be forced to shift the way they deal with their employees, from roles and jobs to this idea of continuously evolving apprenticeships. Everyone in the business, from the C-suite on down to the work experience kid, is going to be an apprentice. Everyone is going to be learning the next thing they need to learn. Everyone in the business will also be teaching apprentices, teaching and learning all the time. Every job is going to be a real mix between those two, with a fair bit of direction from management, working to ensure that the needs of the corporation are also being met in terms of human capacity and human resources, and that they can be met through apprenticeships that they're growing within the organization. And that doesn't look like business as usual today. And that tells you how profound this change is going to be, and it also tells you how quickly it's all going to happen. Again, for the profession of plumbing, no big deal. On the other hand, and I want you to take this point away, it means that you suddenly have a lot to offer. You have a huge opportunity here, because you have a lot to teach existing businesses about how to build apprenticeship-based participation in their organizations. Now, it's not that you have to do this. I'm not putting this burden on you, but let's say you're working with a big construction firm that's organized around jobs and roles, and you see them falling behind precisely because they can't keep up with the new jobs, the new tools, the new skills that are required to make the most of what's on offer. You see them falling behind, you might feel compelled to lend them a hand. To save your own business, you'll help them with theirs. There are thousands of years of human experience in apprenticeship. In many ways, it is the oldest human skill. It's the first one, learning from one another. And we're going to have to relearn it. So the entire rest of the world is now engaged in a sprint to catch up with where you already are. Because in a bit of a surprise, our immediate future looks an awful lot like our ancient past. And it's not because we're heading back to some sort of pre-modern world. It's because the modern world is asking so much of us that we now need, as never before, to draw upon our innate capacity to learn from one another. So take a look at what you do, at the things that are so basic, that are so essential, you barely even notice them in your practice. The practice of participation by apprenticeship is the foundation of the profession of plumbing. You will need to double down on that, because even though you're doing things exactly right, you will also need to do a lot more of it, because tools will be arriving from every direction. And those tools will be offering you incredible new capacities. And to stay competitive, you will need to be able to master them quickly. You will need to be able to master them safely. An apprenticeship can afford you that sort of capacity and protection. Encourage people in your organizations who have a hunger for the new tools to go out and apprentice with the creators of those tools. Then bring them back in, welcome them back into your organization so that they can apprentice your organization in those tools. Start doing that. Keep doing that. Do more of that. Keep sending the smartest folks out to learn. Keep bringing them back in to teach. Keep everyone in your organization learning from one another, learning the best practices, learning the safest ways to work, learning the techniques that offer the greatest protections. All of this is happening so fast, and all of it is happening on such a scale that it will continue to race ahead of the capacity of any regulators or any inspectors to be able to keep pace with it, unless you invite them in too, to learn, to apprentice others in what they know and how they practice, because we're all in this together. We have to move together into this future. And I know, in some ways, the years ahead, they're going to feel like a bit of a slog. We're going to feel like we're on a bit of a treadmill. We're going to feel as if we're always half a step back. And that's a reminder that we need to keep focused on the important thing, which is learning from one another. It's something you already do. It's in the DNA of the profession of plumbing. Remember that. Honor that. And in the years ahead, the plumbing profession will see a growth in participation as all of the world becomes apprenticeships. They'll see a growth in practice as new tools give us incredible new capacities. And in protection as we look to our peers and our new tools to work in partnership to keep us safer than ever before. The future is already here in parts. And now it's up to us to learn how to make it work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now, we have some questions coming through for you. Just let me get a bit organised here, and I've got a couple myself. But Jamie Valdivia asks, you mentioned the program that makes billions of mistakes to get it right.
Yes.
Do you see these new apprentice programs making thousands of mistakes years down the road? And I had a parallel question or does machine learning start reducing the number of mistakes?
Okay, so let me give you an analogy here. A couple of years ago, all of the major car companies promised that we would have self-driving cars just about now. And I'm afraid not, because it turns out that the real world is way more complicated than any computer program is, even if you give that computer program a lot of time to learn. Now, that doesn't mean that 30 or 50 years from now, the balance between what the computer is doing and what the human is doing will continue to shift. It will continue to shift. This is one reason why we're all learning from one another. But the thing that all the automakers are like, oh, we'll have self-driving cars, all right? You can get a car to drive from point A to point B, but then drop it in the middle of the city with pedestrians, with trams, with birds, with road signage. Every state in Australia has a different standard for road signage. So you can't even point a camera at a road sign and expect the car to know what's going on. The world is way more complicated than we tend to credit because we already have so much knowledge about that world that we learned. And so it's not a binary, does the computer ever get so good that the humans aren't needed? Because by then we found other things the computer is not doing well. And so it really is very much around this evolving partnership.
Wow, okay. Just let me check. One of the other questions I had was, are we in danger of having, a person on site, and they got 3 apps all working together because I'm installing a toilet somewhere and I've got to talk to 3 apps. Are these apps operating in silos like humans tend to do, or can we break out of that?
And this is where, when you start getting these apps, you have to start asking very hard questions. How does this work with the other apps? Is this open data? Are you trying to hold on to all of this data so that even I can't have this data about my own practice? And again, this is where the council can start to provide recommendations for good practice around this, right? So I think that there's frameworks for doing this right and wrong. Construction as a whole has operated in kind of both worlds. Some practices are quite proprietary, other practices are quite open. And I think you're going to have to find your way, because absolutely, you don't want a human to have the additional thinking load of having to manage the apps that are trying to make their lives easier. You can take a good example. So a lot of hospitals are still working off paper, even though we've had really good IT solutions in medicine for a long time. And a lot of the reasons because none of the workflow has been designed around the way a doctor or a nurse actually works. And so they get handed these tools, and these tools just basically mess up their workflow, so they become less productive and they put the tool down. So this is your rule of thumb, is yes, you can change your work practice for a tool, but is that change in work practice substantially lowering your productivity, or is it helping you be better at what you do? And that's your gold standard. You need to ask yourself, is this helping me be a better me, rather than am I just using the tool?
Okay. Just let me check to see if there's any new ones, because I want to follow on also from Shane's comment about, so I'm giving a keynote on Friday, and it's this bigger picture stuff. So as a futurist, when we all we operate in our little worlds, and we're going to have smart apps to help me install what I'm going to install.
Yeah.
What do you see as a futurist? There are these big external influences as well, floating around out there.
Yeah.
Some of them may be more important than others, but how do we prepare for those? I mean, climate change is one. Running out of water might be another one.
Yep.
I mean, there's
Yep.
these big
Yep.
elephants in the room
Yep.
that we've got to consider as well.
Yep. So one of the bigger, I guess, long-term changes around the plumbing field is that we're getting better and better at measuring things. And that's a really good thing, because those systems of measurement will come down to both organizations and down to individuals. Within 10 years, I probably should be able to have a readout on my smartwatch of how much water I've used today, right? Between every system that's around that. I go up, I flush a toilet, I use the sink, I take a shower. And so a lot of that is around, can I build systems of awareness for people who are engaged in these? Can that data also be fed into other systems that can manage it? So some of it is around, can we take systemic approaches for how we would change our practice? And can plumbing start to offer solutions around that? And it's not up to you to solve the problem, because that's a cultural thing, but it's up to you to have a palette of possible solutions that people can use. It's the same thing around transport. Transport had gone from just basically being cars in cities to now there's bikes, there's scooters, there's electric vehicles. I'm glad, by the way, it's extremely exciting that you have this whole program on hydrogen, because I just did a series called The Next Billion Cars. Electricity is really good for vehicles if they're relatively urban and there's charging infrastructure for them, which is still a big problem. But if you're slightly less urban, hydrogen's a better choice. And if you're in an environment which is either very hot or very cold, and lots of Australia falls into the very hot column, batteries don't work well. So hydrogen is a far better energy storage medium. And so there are real reasons why hydrogen is the future, but it's not going to be binary. It's going to be some mix of electricity and battery. But hydrogen it's the elephant in the room now. And I think there's a real strong future there.
The lossless emission-free battery.
Yeah, exactly. It's another great way to store power.
Yeah, okay. How much is a billion seconds? I can't work that out.
31 years, 7 months, and 4 days.
It's
a generation, is the way you want to think of it.
A generation is a billion seconds. That's interesting. I might remember that fact. Come on, folks. Someone want to make sure this app's working for me? I've only got 3 questions. Huh? Not happening for you? Okay, we'll sort that out. Jacqueline, we'll just have a chat and we'll open up the next session after lunch so that we make sure we'll get a slide up something so that we make sure everybody's Jamie Valdivia. Where's Jamie? He's gonna so see that guy over there. He knows how to do it. Go and see him at lunchtime. He's got it sorted out. Oh, another one now. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. John Cogley asks, so we need to advocate as industry for much better NBN, otherwise we'll be held back. Now, I've just got NBN. They've just dug up my house outside, and I need to know about this. Better NBN, otherwise we'll be held back. The elephant in the room for Australia. I just live 12 from Perth CBD and have to rely on mobile internet. So give us a comment about NBN and how you're seeing that playing. Now, for example, I know that I think Chattanooga, in the US, it's only a couple of 100,000 people, and they installed, I think, 2 years ago, a megabit per second. Gigabit per second. And guess who moved in? Google, or whether they worked together.
It was Google Fiber.
So talk to us about this.
Okay, so the way you might want to think about it is broadband is oxygen in the 21st century, and you need it to flourish. And we can talk about whether the problem was the NBN got politicized, right? I mean, there was sort of the fact that the telcos didn't want to move, and then when the government came in, it became a political football. And in fact, if you Google Pesce Turnbull, you'll see me having a go at who was then the shadow communications minister, later on became the prime minister, and him having a go at me.
He's more accessible now.
On this topic. This is in 2011, when he was just in opposition. And because I could see that there were going to be some big problems with this. So you're right, we need as much bandwidth as possible. It needs to be everywhere, because every building, so every large building and every home needs to have that kind of bandwidth. But we want to be clear, there's sort of two things to talk about. One is how many bits you can get, which is bandwidth. But there's another very important thing, which is latency, which is how long it takes your bits to get from where they are to where they need to go and to come back again. If you have wired broadband, that tends to be fast. If you have mobile broadband, it's much slower. And so I can say, Siri, pour me a cup of 30-degree water. And if I have mobile broadband, rather than it taking 1 second, it could take 2 or 3. And the problem is most of the computers on the internet don't like to have to wait that long. Yep. And so they will tend to forget or have to send things again because it just took too long for the message to get there. So yes, in some ways, if we want to have a world which is both responsive and is capable of helping us save water, helping us save energy, the better connected it is, the more likely it is to do that. Same time, as I open, the better connected it is, the easier it is to, say, North Korea to come in and turn on every faucet or whatever. And so we have to be aware of both of those.
Okay. I like the concept of a computer forgetting stuff. Let me just check because we might... Oh, Leah Smith asks a very important question. Can Alexa do the dishes?
Nah. So
Thank you,
one of my friends is quite an expert in robotics, has been working in 30 years. One of his gold standards is, can I get a robot smart enough to clear the table? And the answer to that is, unfortunately, still no. Right. All right. You can't get a robot to fold laundry. There's a lovely video that I occasionally slide in where it takes a robot 10 minutes to fold a sheet, right, because it takes 8 of them for it to find the edges correctly. And then it kind of managed to... So there are things that seem really simple to us that are actually really complicated physical tasks that are things that we learned when we were small. And we don't really even understand them well enough to be able to tell a robot, okay, go do that. And you're like, the robot's like, you're giving me nothing here.
That might be a case of the perfect being the enemy of the good, though. The robot will be wanting to get it perfect.
Well, I mean, in the case of clearing the table, you'd want it to be able to pick up a clear water glass, right, which is, hard to see, and where are the edges there with water in it, so it may have different weight, and it's a lot of stuff that, again, we don't even think about. It's just embodied knowledge for us. That is an incredibly complicated task, and now that we've tried to do it, we can actually credit it with how complicated it is.
Okay. So a lot of people in the audience here, and I've had a quick look at the Chroma Smart Command stand out there. This is clever stuff. So what all these guys want to know, what's the next big thing? Come on, tell us what's the next big, the Futurist. Tell us what the next big thing is.
In plumbing or in general?
Well, you're telling us that it's all going to be intermixed anyway. We're going to apply the next smart thinking to plumbing world and everything else. What do you think?
So one of the things that's happened to me over the last year and a half is that I've started using apps to control my diet and exercise, which some people do, some people don't. And the thing that I learned from this is that it's not that we lack willpower, we lack awareness. And a lot of what we're going to be doing over the next billion seconds is building systems that gently help us stay aware of how much we're eating, how much water we're using, how much energy we've used, how far we've walked. All of these things are of a piece because then we can make decisions. It actually increases our ability to make good decisions or bad decisions. You can always do that for ourselves. And I feel as though there's a bit of a change going on because we couldn't measure these things before. We can measure them. Now that we can measure them, we can start to make decisions based on them. So part of what's going on, and plumbing is part of this, is we're moving into a measurement. Data-driven is another word that gets used, but we're moving into a measurement civilization. As we measure, we get more options about what we want to do with that measurement.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Mark a break. He's done a great job, and thank him very much.
Thank you.